I just watched a YouTube short about this subject, and it was actually the very first two-part video I ever put out on this channel, and the video quality went down, and there was one part of the video that was raining and you couldn't really hear anything. So I'm going to go over this subject again with a little bit more life insight too, because a lot of time has passed since I posted that video. The reason why God allows suffering has to do with evolution of the human consciousness, or evolution of consciousness in general. And it is actually an act of mercy. And that sounds very confusing at first, but it's going to make a lot of sense here in a minute. So if you allow a lesser degree of suffering in order to stop the greater degree of suffering that would follow, it is actually a merciful act. And I wrote a thesis on this about how if you don't allow the experience and the transmutation of a certain level of suffering, you actually create hell on earth, because you don't allow the consciousness to evolve to a point where it wants to run from that suffering. And if you do not allow a consciousness or a group consciousness, in this case humanity, go through collective suffering as a body of people or a body of consciousness, and let that cycle play itself out until the consciousness begins to act against the suffering and the pain, you actually prolong it and multiply it. Why? Because it's very similar to a parent cleaning a bedroom. People talk about this in church a lot. It's a skill that has to be developed. The desire to end suffering, at least in the human experience, is a skill that has to be developed. Why? Because if God did not allow suffering, what does that mean? That no matter how we act, no matter how our consciousness evolves, no matter how we think or feel or express, everything becomes permissible, because God will always follow behind and clean up whatever mess is made. And I think that there is a point of no return where God does that, and God covers people out of love and grace and mercy. But in general, it's not a good idea, because that will actually breed hell consciousness. And why? Because if you are constantly reinforcing, we even talk about this in relationships, especially with like narcissistic people or whatever it is, but people that are destructive. If we have enablers in their life, their consciousness never develops, and that destructive pattern actually becomes worse, and they become worse. It's the same thing. Like, I'm a woman who has been through abuse. If you don't stand up for yourself, or you don't leave, or you don't confront the person, whatever you have, whatever tool you have available to you, if you don't do that, what happens? The abuse gets worse. Because why? Because it is being allowed to be permissible. There is no consequence for that suffering. And this is the same thing with suffering itself. Suffering is the consequence to allowing suffering, and it's a feedback loop. And what God is doing by not cleaning up that feedback loop for you without the lesson being learned is actually preventing it in the future. So if, for example, we have things like collective death and mental illness, and well, I wouldn't say mental illness is suffering, though, but things that are intentional suffering or malicious suffering, like violence and death and theft and, all of that sort of stuff. So what happens if you have somebody who is a thief or a murderer, and they're never caught, and the justice system says, yes, we understand you murdered this person. Okay, now we're going to go hide the body for you. We're going to go apologize to the family, but we're not going to convict you. We're not going to put you in jail. What do you think is going to happen? Not only will that person continue to murder, but then probably the people who were negatively affected by that will also maybe want to murder that person. You see this in films like Law Abiding Citizen, or they want to harm that person, or they become so bottled with rage or despair that maybe their life goes down the drain and they start having self-destructive behaviors. Whatever it is, the one suffering caused by the one event of this person murdering this person is now not contained and is now multiplying, because there was no negative consequence or equal opposite karmic suffering intended upon that person in order to exact justice and balance in order to minimize that suffering, or in order to completely eradicate future suffering from that. So when God allows suffering, he allows it in such a way, this is why we know karma to be a cycle. He allows it in such a way that that energy is actually uptaken and cycled somewhere else and does return to that person. So there is actually divine justice as well in this same way. And God just allowing the suffering and always making every situation better and just giving positive energy to things that are negative energy or low vibrational actually breeds the spreading of it, because without karmic punishment, which would be the lack of what would exist if God did not allow suffering energy to exist in the world, there would be no balance and homeostasis in the universe. Now, that was probably a little bit confusing, but just to break it down a little bit further, what that means is that God allows the energy to exist, but what people commonly mistake as God allowing suffering, God does not allow suffering. First of all, that is a limited paradigm, because if you look to, there are miracles that happen all the time for people who reach out towards God. There's a lot of healing that happens with people that reach out. And then, people like Satanists being spontaneously saved and having a moment of consciousness or whatever. So there is mercy and there is justice. And in the way that people discuss it, God is not even allowing suffering anyway. But from that contemporary idea of it, God has to allow that energy to cycle and transmute, and has to allow it to be sent out, because duality is a mirror, right? So it has to be able to reverberate back to that person. And if that energy is stopped, then that person will be allowed to continue to push out suffering, or the collective people who are in negative or low vibrational consciousness will be able to push out suffering and pain energy and low vibrational energy to no end. And what is that? That is unlimited suffering. And what happens with unlimited suffering? What do we call that? We call that hell, right? And what happens by God allowing people to have karmic consequences and allowing the behaviors to take place so that the echo or the return of that dual energy can happen, lessons are taught. We see it all the time. Humans are actually capable of tremendous change and tremendous growth. And in fact, in the universe, we all say it all the time, change is the only constant. So on top of the fact that that's a limited perspective, when you open your eyes a little bit more, justice is always served. And a consciousness cannot grow unless it is allowed to experience even the lower vibrational things. And that is collective consciousness as well. And then if you really want to break this down further, as a side note, this is subjective. This is up for debate. A lot of people who are awakened and who are close to God kind of understand that they've had a soul contract, and some people voluntarily, and some souls voluntarily come here to experience that. And they know when they're coming that they're going to experience suffering. Once you're born and once your consciousness is limited, because this is a low vibrational planet right now, you forget that. But prior to coming here, if you believe in these sorts of higher things, or if you've been able to connect to them, there's actually a lot of people that have soul contracts that understand they're coming to stop particular cycles of suffering, and that they're going to have to go through it first. And these souls willingly agree to this prior to coming here. I've even had visions where they've kind of been backed up and validated by other visions with other souls saying the exact same thing. So there's this universal idea of what Earth is in people's consciousness before they come here. I even particularly had a vision where I was making a contract to come here, and I kept saying to the soul next to me, and the soul that I was agreeing to make this contract with when I came here, I kept saying, I don't want to come here. It's so dark. This planet is so dark. Like, that planet is scary. I don't want to go. And then, I had all this reassurance and all of that, and I was still voluntarily making this agreement to come and do what, as a chosen one, I'm here to do. But this is actually a common phenomenon that you see in other people who do these regressions, or who have these visions, or have dreams, or whatever. There's this commonality that we've all said, okay, I understand how dark and low vibrational and scary this planet is, and I'm going anyway. So maybe there's some things in the universe we don't understand. And when you start to connect to those, and when you start to connect to source, a lot of those questions are actually answered. I have been through a tremendous amount of suffering. So I'm not saying this from, I guess, glass house mentality. I'm not really sure what the phrase would be for that, but I'm not saying this from some removed perspective or some idealistic perspective. I have been through tremendous, very unfair suffering in my life, and I've been able to come to this conclusion, adding up all the pieces and sitting with God and asking these questions and having very clear answers to them and very clear peace when I find that out, versus living in another paradigm. And this is one of the paradigms I used to live in, is that God is uninterested in humans, or God is uninterested in our souls, or uninterested in loving us. God does not love us, whatever. I've had all of those paradigms and I've worked my way through them, and I don't live by them. I don't believe in those anymore. And it is because too many things have added up and made sense, both in communicating with God and then actually watching normal life unfold. And one forgiveness exercise I went through kind of backed this up as well, as far as poetic justice and karmic cycles and duality echoing back the pain to somebody that they cause in the world. Every single time somebody has done me wrong in life, God asked me to look back and ask how their life status was going, or how their mental health was going, or how their life circumstances have played out after a particular time, or how maybe in the case of a relationship, I've had lots of relationships where the man is either miserable now, or the man got cheated on after I was cheated on by this particular man. So there's situations like that as well. And then I actually know somebody who was mistreating me very poorly. And yes, I was allowing it. So I was working on some codependency things with that. But also, I even thought back with a more recent situation, there was somebody who was misusing me pretty severely. And they were pretty verbally abusive and kind of a bully. And they're actually in the middle of a lawsuit now, and their license is suspended. I'm not going to say who it is, but things like that. I've watched this time and time again. I've watched it with family members. I have watched it with people who I had considered to be a friend who did some not so friendly things. I have watched this with every man that I have poorly chosen, who ended up not being the best partner. And I say that mildly because I've had to deal with abuse and things like that. And whether through the grapevine or, because of family connection, knowing what's up just by having some degree of relation to them. Every single person that has done me wrong didn't immediately face a consequence, or a consequence that was the exact same thing that they did to me, but they eventually met equal and opposite suffering. So when you are covered under God or under source, or however you look at it and call it, it will protect you and it will bring justice to you. And not necessarily in your time or the way that you thought was going to happen. And it may not necessarily be the type of revenge you as a human would want to incite on somebody, which, by the way, is actually low vibrational, and it can keep you from not just the internal peace we talk about, but if you want to manifest great things, it will stop you from manifesting too, because that doesn't match high vibrational reality. Not that I haven't been a culprit of that, or still aren't at times, because I'm a very fiery woman. But in general, if you really sit down and do this exercise, you'll see that God doesn't allow suffering, or doesn't allow it permanently in the way that we think. And if you zoom out in your lens a little bit, humanity is actually getting better. Anytime there is great turmoil before a resolution. It's the war and peace cycle of duality. And those rocky times and those scary times and the storms of the chaos that ensues in the world in between humans, it is always for our evolution, and it is always for our growth. And just like in your relationships and just like your personal shadow work and self-improvement, you have to unearth something ugly and you have to battle it before something beautiful comes out of it. And that's what happens with a lot of these suffering cycles that we go through as a people. And I think especially in places like America where I live, I can't speak for other nations, our quality of life materially is much better and our problems are different. What we're battling now is the problems with consciousness and compassion, because we've already beat the suffering of the types of poverties and lifestyles or greater degrees of racial suffering and gender suffering, whatever. So even though things always feel bad at the stage we're in, when we look back, it could have been a lot worse, or we could have fought battles that our ancestors fought where the suffering was tremendously increased and it was so much more difficult to find rights than it is now, you know? So I think maybe it looks and it feels worse than the suffering actually is, where if you took a step back and tried to put yourself in the shoes of fighting the battles that your ancestors fought, especially if you're an ethnic minority in America like I am, you'll see that the suffering is lessening. It changes form and is always there to provide a different type of lesson, you know, and there is always a beauty that is unearthed through that suffering, where we grow and we no longer make the same mistakes. And there are people who will come along for the ride, and unfortunately there's even people in my life, you know, now that I've had to drop because I realize they're going to be the types that don't come along for the ride. But in general, most people want growth and want to be better, and suffering is a path that leads us away to the types of consciousness, leads us away from the types of consciousness that we don't want permanently in our reality. And sometimes we filter through that and we sift through that and we live it first to show this is not the way, because what leads to long-term suffering may look pretty in the beginning, and what is short-term suffering, that is righteous suffering and good suffering, may be something that we avoid. And sometimes we don't know which suffering is the type that happens because we're doing what's right, or the type that happens when we're doing what is wrong and selfish. And sometimes the answers are not as straightforward as we would like them to be. So sometimes we fall into those patterns, and we fall into those patterns collectively until we reach that breaking point. Because no matter who you are, no matter how strong you are, individually or collectively, you might be able to withstand a greater degree of hell or a greater degree of suffering before you say, okay, no more. But eventually everybody says, okay, no more.